Welcome back everyone. This is another video on request. In today's session, I'm going to give you the workbook solutions of the short story, The Boy Who Broke the Bank, written by Ruskin. This is part 1. In today's session, I'm going to discuss the first 3 workbook extracts. And in video number 2, I'm going to solve the rest, the other questions from this short story. Do check the pinned comment section for the easy explanation video. Extract 1. Read the extract. It's there on the screen. Now the questions. Who was Nathu? Briefly describe what he was doing. So in this question there are 2 subparts. Always change paragraphs. Who was Nathu? Nathu, the protagonist of Ruskin-Bond's The Boy Who Broke the Bank, was a sweeper boy who worked at the People Nagar Bank. So this is a brief answer. What are the key words and expressions here? Nathu was the protagonist of Ruskin-Bond's story, The Boy Who Broke the Bank. Protagonist जरूर mention करना अपने answer में. He was a sweeper boy. What was his occupation? He was a sweeper boy and he worked at the People Nagar Bank. So if you write all these things in your answers, I'm sure you will get good marks. Now, briefly describe what he was doing. Nathu क्या कर रहा था? He was grumbling to himself. Number 1. As he was sweeping the steps of the People Nagar Bank, वो जो steps है, जो stairs है, उसे sweep कर रहा था. He was sweeping that with his small broom. He used his small broom hurriedly and carelessly. और वो अपना काम कैसे कर रहा था? Hurriedly or carelessly. Banging his pan against a dustbin. So he was also banging his pan against a dustbin. Number 3. इन सारे points को अपने answer में जरूर highlight कर देना. So this is the first question. Brief answers. The length of the answers is going to vary, so don't worry about the length. It will depend on the questions available. Why was he doing his duty hurriedly and carelessly? This is important. Hurriedly and carelessly, वो अपना duty जो है वो क्यों कर रहा था? एक specific reason था. Nathu was doing his duty hurriedly and carelessly because क्या reason था? He was not interested in doing it properly. जल्दी जल्दी वो अपना काम खत्म करना चाहता था. वो बिल्कुल ही इस काम में इंटरेस्ट नहीं ले रहा था. He was angry. और ये क्यों? He was angry, he was annoyed, irritated and upset. उसका जो मेंटल स्टेट था वो ठीक नहीं था. He was mentally disturbed. In fact, वो गुस्से में था, वो annoyed भी था और वो बहुत irritated feel कर रहा था. So this is point number 2. He had not been paid his regular salary although it was the 20th of the month. Again, another important point. वो गुस्सा क्यों कर रहा था? क्योंकि उसे अपना सैलरी नहीं मिला. It was already 20th of the month. वो हाइक भी चाह रहा था बैंक से, मगर वो भी नहीं मिला. प्लस और क्यों गुस्से में आ गया नाथू? क्योंकि सैलरी भी ठीक टाइम पे उसे नहीं मिल रहा था. इसीलिए काम में कोई दिलचस्पी नाथू को नहीं था. Why did Nathu bang his pan against the dustbin? What does this action tell us about Nathu's state of mind, his mental state? Nathu banged his pan against the dustbin because he had already decided to quit his job at the bank as soon as he got his salary. He wanted to emphasize this point. वो अपने आप से ही बात कर रहा था. मैंने तो सोच लिया है बैंक में और काम नहीं करूंगा. And he wanted to assert himself by banging the pan against the dustbin and also gain for himself confidence. अपना जो decision है वो नाथू implement करना चाहता था. हाँ, मैं ठीक कर रहा हूँ, मैं ये काम नहीं करूंगा. He wanted to emphasize this. He wanted to assert himself. It was a kind of self-assertion. वो अपने आप से बात कर रहा था और वो जो अपना डिसीजन है वो जाहिर करना चाहता था. His frustration and dissatisfaction are also evident. So he wanted to emphasize this point, gain for himself confidence, and as well as give expression to his frustration and dissatisfaction. He was frustrated as well as dissatisfied. And what does this tell us about Nathu's state of mind? Nathu was in a bad mood and is feeling defiant and wants to assert himself, perhaps to cope up. So Nathu bad mood में था, he was feeling defiant, वो अब ये सहन नहीं करेगा, and he wants to assert himself. वो जाहिर करना चाहता है, मैं ये सहन नहीं करूँगा, इस ill treatment को मैं और सहन नहीं करूँगा. Perhaps to cope up with such delay and mistreatment as well as teach the bank a lesson. Who was Sitaram? What did he ask Nathu? How did he try to help Nathu? इस question में 3 subparts है. So make 3 paragraphs. Change the paragraphs and don't miss out any one subpart. Read the question thoroughly and answer all the questions. Sitaram कौन था? Sitaram was the son of a washerman. He was Nathu's friend. So यहाँ पे मैंने 2 points use किया है. बहुत सारे बच्चे ये नहीं करेंगे, वो सिर्फ लिख देंगे सीताराम वॉज द सन ऑफ अ वॉशरमैन. मगर तुम क्या करोगे? एक एक्स्ट्रा पॉइंट ऐड कर दोगे. ही वॉज नाथूज फ्रेंड. ही वॉज entrusted, he was given the task of delivering the freshly washed and ironed clothes to the customers. So this was Sitaram. What did he ask Nathu? उसने नाथू से क्या पूछा? He asked Nathu if he was annoyed because the authorities of the bank did refusing to pay him an extra 2 rupees a month. And how did he try to help Nathu? He tried to help Nathu. What would he do? He would keep a lookout for any jobs that might be suitable for Nathu. So brief answers. मगर 3 questions मैंने perfectly touch कर लिया है, मैंने mention कर लिया है. I did not miss out anyone. Why was the incident of not paying the salary introduced in the beginning of the story? What were its consequences? Result क्या था? The incident of not paying the salary was introduced in the beginning to highlight, to show the theme of the exploitation of the poor. Ruskin Bond यहाँ पे क्या highlight करना चाहते थे? The theme of exploitation of the poor, very important. Nathu had no means of redressal. वो किसे जाके बोलेगा? उसे पे नहीं मिल रहा था, उसे कोई हाइक नहीं दे रहा था, तो कोई फायदा भी नहीं था क्योंकि वो एक पुअर स्वीपर बॉय था. He had no means of redressal and his annoyance unwillingly, unknowingly intensified the action in the plot of the story. A sense of dissatisfaction and angst, anger, agony. A sense of dissatisfaction and angst was established within the narrative. So this answer is important. And what were its consequences? This delay in the payment not only makes Nathu furious, Nathu is furious, but also is a source of the downfall of the bank that harassed him by not paying his dues. The restlessness of Nathu. Nathu restless हो रहा था, कब मुझे पेमेंट ठीक पेमेंट मिल जाएगा. So the restlessness of Nathu soon becomes a shared experience. It becomes a shared experience when a rumor about the sound bank becoming bankrupt spreads through the town and there is turmoil. This is the consequence. These are the results. So end of extract 1. Extract 2 now. Who was Mrs. Srivastava? Mrs. Srivastava was the lady of the 4th house Sitaram visited. And how can you say that she cares for her family? She had to do some shopping, but before going out, she gave instructions to the ayah about looking after the baby, number 1. She told the cook, number 2. not to be late with the midday meal. Thus she cared for her family. She looked after her family. उसके पास बहुत लोग हेल्प करने वाले थे, मगर फिर भी इंस्ट्रक्शंस तो मिसेस श्रीवास्तवा ने ही दिया था. What did she do at the market? Mrs. Srivastava had to do some shopping for clothes at the People Nagar marketplace. Do you think she was a regular visitor? Do you think it was a regular practice, and why? Yes, it was a regular practice. The phrase to make her customary tour of the cloth shops suggests that it was Mrs. Srivastava's regular practice. Understood? So here I'll just make a correction. Suggested that it was Mrs. Srivastava's regular practice. After this, let us now see what is question number 3. What did Mrs. Bhushan and Mrs. Srivastava talk about? Mrs. Bhushan and Mrs. Srivastava were talking to each other. The latter complained of the summer, which she affirmed was definitely the hottest in the history of People Nagar. They talked about a sample of the cloth that Mrs. Bhushan was going to buy. So this is number 2, the summer. They talked about the summer. Then they talked about the sample of cloth that Mrs. Bhushan was going to buy. And they also talked about, for 5 minutes, they discussed its shade, texture and design. Having exhausted the topic, Mrs. Srivastava told Mrs. Bhushan how the People Nagar Bank did not pay its sweeper his wages for over a month. So 20th of the month से क्या हो गया? Over a month sweeper को, एक साधारण सा sweeper है, उसे बैंक ने पे ही नहीं किया. So this information was shared by Mrs. Srivastava to Mrs. Bhushan during their conversation. What apparently had happened to the People Nagar Bank? Apparently, the People Nagar Bank was on the verge of collapse, about to go bankrupt. They had stopped paying employees. How did the news spread? The news spread through the bazaar with the rapidity of forest fire, starting with Mrs. Srivastava telling Mrs. Bhushan about a sweeper boy's complaint of non-payment of wages, a very specific answer. It spread through the bazaar. How did it spread? Through the bazaar. कैसे? Very quickly with the rapidity of forest fire. And किसने स्टार्ट किया था? मिसेस श्रीवास्तवा ने मिसेस भूषण को कहा था, एक स्वीपर बॉय कंप्लेन कर रहा था कि उसे अपना जो पेमेंट है वो नहीं मिला. इट ट्रैवल्ड फ्रॉम शॉप टू शॉप. एक दुकान से दूसरे दुकान तक, सर्कुलेटेड अमंग द कस्टमर्स एंड देन स्प्रेड इन वेरियस डायरेक्शंस एंड रीच डिफरेंट इंडिविजुअल्स एंड ग्रुप्स. So you will have to highlight all these points in your answer. How did the news spread? How did the rumors spread? Briefly describe the conversation between Mrs. Bhushan and her husband. Mrs. Bhushan shared the news she heard from Mrs. Srivastava about the troubles of the People Nagar Bank, mentioning that the bank had stopped paying employees in quite a concerned manner. वो बहुत चिंता में थी और जल्दी जल्दी वो आके अपने हस्बैंड से इस बात को उन्होंने शेयर किया. मिस्टर भूषण जोक्ड अबाउट हाउ हिज वाइफ मूव फ्रॉम शॉप टू शॉप टू अनदर लाइक अ बी इन अ फ्लावर गार्डन. वो तो जोक कर रहे थे, वो तो रिलैक्स्ड मूड में थे, मगर जो वाइफ है वो बहुत चिंतित हो पड़ी थी. मिसेस भूषण गेट्स irritated and speaks about the scorching heat. What does this show about them? They are a middle class couple. While Mrs. Bhushan is restless, gets easily anxious, irritated and is more gullible. Gullible का मतलब जो दूसरे जो बात करते हैं उससे बहुत जल्द प्रभावित हो जाते हैं, उन्हें हम gullible कहेंगे. So she was restless, she got anxious quite easily or irritated and was more gullible. Mrs. Bhushan is like this and Mr. Bhushan appears to be more relaxed. less affected by the news. He jokes and pulls Mrs. Srivastava's legs and the latter gets irritated. So this indicates that they have different personalities and the conversation between them is humorous. Extract number 3 now. Who was Deep Chand? Deep Chand was a barber in People Nagar and owned a barber shop. Who gave him the news? Kamal Kishore, the owner of a photographic shop, informed Deep Chand that the People Nagar Bank was about to collapse. And why? Deep Chand had an account there in the bank and perhaps had deposited his money. Kamal Kishore suggested Deep Chand to withdraw the money as soon as possible. He wanted to save his friend from a financial loss and was gullible enough to believe in the news even without any verification. Kamal Kishore ने कुछ verify नहीं किया. उन्होंने ये सुना, इस rumor को उन्होंने सुना और फिर उस rumor को उन्होंने spread कर दिया to Deep Chand. And he wanted to help Deep Chand. इसीलिए विदाउट एनी वेरिफिकेशन जल्दी जल्दी उन्होंने आके दीपचंद को सारी बात कह दी. How did he react to the rumor? Do you think that he followed the advice given to him? How did Deep Chand react to the rumor? Deep Chand was cutting the hair of an elderly gentleman, was so startled, he was so surprised, so shocked that his hand shook and he nicked his customer's right ear. He was taken aback by the suddenness of the whole thing and seemed concerned about the situation. So this was his reaction. And do you think he followed the advice given to him by Kamal Kishore? It is possible that he followed the advice of withdrawing the money from the bank but was unable to withdraw money as the bank had gone through all its ready cash. How did his customer react? Was his reaction followed by other people in the town? The shared experience. How did his customer react? The customer yelped with pain and distress. Pain because of the cut and distress because of the awful news he had just heard. With one side of his neck still unshaven, he sped across the road to the general merchant store where there was a telephone and immediately he dialed Seth Govind Ram's number. उन्होंने वेट नहीं किया. जिस हालत में वो थे उसी हालत में वो वहां से दौड़ के चले गए to the general merchant store to call Seth Govind Ram, and he dialed his number directly. And was his reaction followed by other people? His reaction was followed by other people in the town. The news spread through the bazaar with the rapidity of forest fire, and his restlessness, LESS, his restlessness seemed to become a shared experience. What was it that concerned the customer more than his injury? What was it? The customer's primary concern was not his injury but the news he had just heard about the impending collapse of the People Nagar Bank. Moreover, the unavailability of Seth Govind Ram at People Nagar fueled his anxiety. So, what was his concern? Seth Govind Ram यहाँ पे नहीं है. The bird has flown. अब क्या होगा? मैं तो लुट गया, मैं तो बर्बाद हो गया. इंजुरी का क्या है? एक दिन में वो ठीक हो जाएगा शायद. And what does this reflect about the general tendency of the customers of the bank? The customers of the bank were also worried about their potential loss of their money deposited in the bank rather than their own physical well-being. Rather than in their own physical well-being. There was general distrust, very important, there was general distrust for the bank and its owner. They were deeply concerned about the potential consequences of its collapse. Name 2 people who spread the rumor. How did each get the news and how he or she spread it? The 2 people who spread the rumor about the People Nagar Bank were Kamal Kishore and Mrs. Srivastava. Mrs. Srivastava shared this information with Mrs. Bhushan during their conversation at the market. The rumor started from there. Kamal Kishore got the news and informed Deep Chand. And this was crucial because Deep Chand's words, "the bird has flown," intensified the spread of the news. So in this way, these two people spread the rumor. This is the end of part 1, and in part 2, I'll discuss 4 extracts, the remaining 4 extracts from the workbook, Morning Star workbook.